Hi, welcome to the Veteran Mental and Physical Health webinar. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tiffany Purrington, and I'm the Senior Program Manager for Amazon's Veteran Mental Wellbeing and Suicide Prevention Program. I'm an Army combat veteran with a spouse who is still currently serving in the military. Today, I'm joined by former NFL linebacker Donnie Edwards, neurophysiologist Dr. Kate Pate, and my coworker, Senior Program Manager Matt Williams. We will do quick introductions followed by a presentation from Dr. Pate, and then we'll wrap things up with a quick Q&A session with Matt, Donnie, and Dr. Pate. I'll be moderating the chat, so please feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A at the end. Let's get started with introductions. Donnie, can you give me a quick introduction?
Sure. My name is Donnie Edwards, former NFL player, played 30 years of consecutive football, played 13 years active in the NFL, and now run a nonprofit giving back to our military veterans. And we also do a transition program for our special forces and NFL players.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Matt, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, I will. And I always like to brag on Donnie that he's fourth in the history of the league in tackles too. He always leaves that out, but I think it's important. My name is Matt Williams. I'm on Tiffany's team on Global Military Affairs and have the honor to work on our Disabled Veteran Support Program. Spent 12 and a half years between the Army and the CIA as a paramilitary operations officer and case officer, also married to an Army vet. So this topic is, and CIA vet, she is too. So this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. And I will say this, I have seen Doc Pate's approach firsthand, personally and in others, and I personally think it's life-changing. So Tiffany, thank you so much for setting this up.
Awesome, thank you, Matt. I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Pate now to introduce herself and begin her presentation. Dr. Pate.
Thank you, Tiffany, and yeah, thanks to Amazon for having me here. I'm really honored to be talking about a topic that is extremely important and something I'm deeply passionate about. And just a quick background for myself, I have a PhD in neurophysiology, and I've been conducting medical research in a number of different areas over the years, including traumatic brain injury and spinal cord injury. But for the past 8 years, I've been focusing solely on military medical research. Additionally, I'm a coach, a health coach in the military, veteran, and first responder space. And although a lot of my work is focused on those in the special operations community, much of what I'll be speaking about here today is relevant to veterans from all branches and occupational specialties, as well as non-veteran civilians and professional athletes and all human beings, really. So with that, let's jump right in. I'll start the presentation here. Let's see. Maybe. Let's see. Can you guys see my screen?
Not yet, Doc.
Okay, let's see. This worked in the practice round. Let's see. Well, shoot, hold on, guys. Technical difficulties here.
Yeah, no worries. We'll give you a second.
Okay, there you go. You got that one?
Yep. Perfect.
Awesome.
Great.
All right. Okay. Let's begin. So just so everybody is aware of where we're going, I like to give a brief agenda here. So I'm going to go through a brief introduction and discuss a little bit of physiology just to lay some groundwork for what we're going to get into. And we'll go transition from there into stress and a stress-specific term that's relevant to this discussion called allostasis. And then we're going to talk specifically about some stressors that the veteran population experiences, specifically related to traumatic brain injury, toxic exposures, post-traumatic stress disorder, and moral injury. And I refer to those as stressors because we're going to talk about this term called allostasis. But if it's confusing and you want to think about those things as just kind of exposures or events or injuries, that's fine too. We're going to talk then about the cumulative effect that all of these things have on a human being and the effect that it has on physiology that leads to a number of different symptoms that this population faces. And then we're going to talk about the good news, what we can do to help ourselves and our loved ones, and then transition into a Q&A with Donnie and Matt. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan. I wanted to open with this quote because it sums up why we're here today. Veterans disability compensation was conceived from this address where President Lincoln made it the imperative of our nation to take care of our injured and wounded service members. And fortunately or unfortunately, we're having this conversation today because I think we're witnessing the ramifications of what happens when we push human beings to and beyond the absolute limits of what they can handle, whether it's physically, mentally, spiritually, or emotionally. And I think we're all kind of realizing that we don't really have the adequate systems in place to take care of these people and to help them heal and return them to an optimal quality of life. Although we're here specifically to talk about veterans, as I mentioned before, I think you'll get to understand that these are really human issues and not veteran-specific issues. And it's not to minimize the unique set of experiences and exposures that service members face while they're in the military, but it's to say that there isn't anything inherently wrong with veterans. And despite the pop culture narrative, they're not broken. Any human being placed in similar circumstances would be dealing with similar outcomes. So my hope is that you think about this material in the context of how it may be relevant for you as a human being, and whether that's as a veteran or not, and those in your family. And the more informed we all are, the more we can help one another. And so that's the hope for today, is that we all take something away from this that can help ourselves or somebody else. So we're going to get into a brief primer on physiology, and I promise it won't be too technical for those of you whose anxiety I just spiked, but we do need to talk about some basic things that are relevant to human physiology, because life doesn't happen in a vacuum. We can't talk about our experiences and isolate things like TBI or moral injury and discuss them outside of the context of the human being to whom or within whom it's happening. So in order to understand this backdrop of who we are as human beings and how these things impact us, we'll just get into a little bit of groundwork for physiology. So we're going to start with the nervous system, which is comprised of the brain, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, and it's essentially responsible for integrating sensory information from our internal and external environments and coordinating motor output in a way that ultimately helps us survive. And we have to do this because there are stressors, both internal and external, that come at us that will push us in different directions, and we need to be able to maintain some sort of stability, which some of you may have heard the term homeostasis before. We need to be able to maintain some kind of level of stability or homeostasis in the face of stress, and that's a term called allostasis. There are multiple divisions of the nervous system, and some of you may have heard the term autonomic nervous system and sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. It's really complex and far more complex than we have time for today, but suffice it to say that the sympathetic nervous system ultimately prepares us for action, and the parasympathetic nervous system prepares us for rest and repair. Our brains are the control centers that drive all of this, and they're really, you can think about our brains as prediction wizards. They help us move through the world unconsciously predicting what's about to happen and preparing us for that, rather than responding to each moment in the moment as if it's a novel moment and a novel experience, even though it technically is. It's just metabolically too costly to be reactive rather than predictive. And so that's what our brain does. And this is really important because if the brain is injured or it's not able to work properly, or it learns or is conditioned in a maladaptive way due to prior experiences like trauma, it can affect everything about how we experience and see the world. And this has great implications for traumatic brain injury, where there may be an injury to the brain which will affect everything about our experience and how we see the world. The next system we're going to talk about is the endocrine system, and some of you may not be familiar with this, but it is a sort of a slower system that relies upon chemicals as communication rather than the nervous system, which relies upon synapses and quick nerve impulses. But the endocrine system is a chemical messenger system, and the chemicals, most of the chemicals are hormones, which you may have heard that term before. And the endocrine system is really important in maintaining health and performance, and it balances our hormones very carefully And it's important to know that even slight deviations in your hormone levels, depending on which hormone we're talking about, could have great impacts on how you feel and the quality of life that you have. There are two major endocrine centers or regions in the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And this is important because as we talk about traumatic brain injury, those centers are upstream of all the other glands that we have and organs that we have that are part of the endocrine system, and they affect the downstream hormones like cortisol and testosterone, for example. So if those areas of the brain are injured or damaged or dysfunctional, it can affect downstream hormone release, which will have a great impact on our physiology. And there's a lot of evidence to, I guess, in support of endocrine dysfunction following traumatic brain injury, but also following chronic stress too. And there's a number of different hypothesized mechanisms for how that could happen. Direct impact injuries and direct dysfunction due to TBI, but also secondary insults relating to low blood pressure, low blood oxygen, changes in metabolism, etc. And there's a lot of evidence to show that central nervous system inflammation can also impact these centers. Finally, the last system that we're going to talk about that's relevant to our discussion today is the immune system, which is a collection of barriers, cells, chemical signals, and proteins. And ultimately, it serves to protect us against invading pathogens, but also foreign and toxic substances. And that will become relevant when we get into veteran-specific exposures. The immune system is also critical for cleaning up and repairing any kind of tissue damage or cellular damage. And again, this has great implications when it comes to traumatic brain injury. And part of our immune system, when you hear the term inflammation, that is part of our immune response. It's part of our innate immune response, which is a non-specific immunovascular response. It happens anytime we have an injury. So that swelling and redness and puffiness and increased pain that you get at the site of a wound, that's inflammation, and that is a non-specific response that happens to help clean up and repair tissue. Well, this happens in the brain too, and this is a good thing. We hear inflammation in the news today, and in various stories, and inflammation is always painted in a bad light, but inflammation is critical, and it's a really good thing. We absolutely have to have it in order to repair injuries. The problem is where the inflammatory response is stuck in the pro-inflammatory tissue degradation phase, and it never switches to the anti-inflammatory reparative phase. And that can happen. We don't fully understand all of the mechanisms as to why that happened, but that can happen in brain injury, where instead of completing the inflammatory response and ending with tissue repair, the inflammation response is sort of stuck in the on switch. So pivoting a little bit, talking about stress, like inflammation, stress isn't inherently bad. It's actually critical for survival because it leads to things like adaptation, growth, change, and learning. However, we can overload our ability to cope with stressors, and that is when things can go wrong and dysfunction can occur. And that'll lead to symptoms that we'll discuss a little bit later on. And the term for achieving stability in the face of stressors, again, is allostasis. How we achieve allostasis involves our stress response system, which prepares us for action and to respond to internal and external threats. So that could be motor output that leads to fighting, foraging, or hunting, or even something like solving problems. The stress response system involves a number of different parts of our physiology, and the nervous system, endocrine system, and immune system that I just mentioned are all involved. And the autonomic part of our nervous system, the sympathetic that I mentioned before, prepares us for action. So that could be activities like increases in blood pressure and heart rate and oxygen delivery, but it also downregulates things that we don't really need if we're preparing to take action to deal with a threat. So for example, you don't need to prioritize digesting a Chipotle burrito if you have to run from or fight a grizzly bear. So it's actually a really helpful system to have, and it's pretty elegant the way that it's designed, and it is complex. The endocrine system will start to release things like cortisol and epinephrine. Basically, the goal is to make us, again, available to fight or take action and increase glucose availability for working muscles. And our immune system is often pro-inflammatory in the brain and periphery in response to an acute stressor. Again, all of this is protective and beneficial in the short term, but if we have too many stressors or stressors that are present for too long, it comes at a cost, which is ultimately allostatic overload. And this can be characterized by physiological dysfunction and acceleration of disease processes. Again, we'll get into symptoms shortly, but the list can be pretty long. Some of you may have heard the term operator syndrome, which is a specific kind of allostatic overload related to a profession. So sometimes you may hear it referred to as operational allostatic overload. And that's specific to the special operations community. And in addition, it has a hallmark injury of traumatic brain injury. And that in and of itself, TBI, as we'll hear shortly, is also responsible for a number of these symptoms by itself. And then when you add other stressors and other exposures and experiences on top of it, it can make it very difficult to manage, and a person can experience a great number of contributing symptoms. Just to make sure we're all on the same page and everybody's aware of where stress comes from, there's a number of different types that those within the military, veteran, and first responder populations face. But of course, every human being has experience with these types of stressors. But what is unique about the military and first responder personnel is that they're often exposed to a constellation of unique stressors at the extreme ends of the spectrum and often in combination. For psychological stressors, the fear and anxiety could literally be about anything. This is where, you know, people talk about the perspective, you know, perspective is everything, and how you view something is critical to how your body responds. And there is some truth to that, because our perspective on, so for example, maybe financial stress or maybe family issues or health issues will determine how great of a stressor that becomes. Additionally, the psychological stressors include cognitive demands. So a lot of activities that are, you know, require intense focus or mental gymnastics, if you will. Then we have the physical stressors, so sleep deprivation, nutrition, and this is where injuries fall in line. So things like traumatic brain injury, those are any kind of injury, physical injury to the body, those are physical stressors, and they add to allostatic load. And then we have environmental, which this is a huge category for our military service members and first responders as well, especially with regard to toxins and pollutants, but even the extreme climate changes and pathogen exposures and drugs as well. Ultimately, all of these add up. So pivoting a little bit and getting into the specific things that our military and veteran communities face, starting with toxic exposures. This one, I'm sure many of you have noticed, has been in the news quite a bit over the past few years, especially related to burn pits. But the burn pits are just one part of this, I guess, overall problem. It's a busy slide, and I apologize for that, but I wanted to highlight this new Department of Defense research program that came out this year, focusing on investigating toxic exposures in the military and veteran populations. And this is important because, you know, a lot of people assume if you have any kind of exposure to this, any of these items on this list, that you will absolutely develop health issues, and that is not always true. We don't fully understand the impacts of these exposures, but we do have evidence that exposure to toxins can increase one's risk, at least, for things like neurodegenerative diseases, cancer, and other illnesses. And you can see here that the research, this is a quote from this research program that the congressionally directed medical research program put out. They're specifically naming neurotoxin exposure, Gulf War illness, airborne hazards and burn pits, as well as prophylactic medications like mefloquine, pesticides, organophosphates, toxic industrial chemicals, materials, metals, and minerals. This list is extremely long, and again, many people in the military and first responder community have had many of these exposures. The reason this is relevant and why we're talking about it is that toxins can cause direct damage to tissues, but they also trigger an immune response, And the inflammation that can occur in response to these exposures can prime a person to be more susceptible to an exaggerated response and impaired healing following any kind of subsequent injury or illness. And this is really relevant to what we're talking about next, which is traumatic brain injury. The DoD definition of TBI is a traumatically induced structural injury and or physiological disruption of brain function as a result of an external force with new onset or worsening symptoms. And Donnie and Matt can both speak to this, but there are a number of different ways these external forces can be applied. So you could have what we refer to as blunt trauma, which is the head being struck by an object or the head striking an object. So again, very, very common what we see in the NFL and other contact sports. These are very common types of impacts to the head. There's also acceleration, deceleration injuries without any kind of external impact. There are penetrating injuries, so something that might break through the skull. And then there are forces generated from things like blasts and explosions, which is very common in the military, and we refer to that as blast trauma. It's very common in the military. It was the hallmark injury of the global war on terror was improvised explosive devices, or IEDs. But also within the special operations community, a number of traumatic brain injuries from blast exposure alone during training were significant. And if you've read the paper Operator Syndrome by Chris Free, you'll note that 85% of special operations forces reported TBIs during training alone, which were often blast types of exposures. Now, it's important to know that not all individuals exposed to an external force will sustain a traumatic brain injury. It's not always every bump on the head leads to that, but it is important to pay attention to that. And I'm not going to read all of these quotes, but suffice it to say that traumatic brain injury is an epidemic within the military. And numbers within the military and the civilian populations are grossly underreported. So you can see this figure here on the bottom left. These are reported and documented traumatic brain injuries, but there is a huge number that goes unreported. I mean, I have a hard time believing that in 22 years of war and millions of service members that we only have 463,000 documented TBIs. Again, when you have quotes like this middle one here, where 70% of service members sustain some sort of TBI, specifically blast-related injury. TBI can cause direct damage to areas of the brain that affect normal functioning, including endocrine function. But the immune response following injury can progress to a chronic state of inflammation, as I mentioned before, and that can cause further damage and dysfunction. Again, this is important because the inflammation following TBI can progress and prime a person's brain to be more susceptible to further exaggerated responses and impaired healing following any kind of subsequent illness or injury. And it does affect systemic or whole body inflammation. And it appears that this type of inflammation can make a person more susceptible to developing post-traumatic stress disorder following an experience of trauma. So pivoting into trauma, what is trauma? Trauma is essentially an experience of or witnessing of a life-threatening event. And post-traumatic stress or a highly activated stress response system following trauma is absolutely normal. I don't know about you, but when my life is in danger, I would probably be on alert and on edge for some time after. I mean, if you experience something that's life-threatening or witness it, you're probably not going to want to let your guard down in case it happens again. I think that this is a completely normal thing that many of us have experienced or would likely experience following trauma. However, the hope is that that heightened stress response system over time would come back down to baseline and you would resume life as normal as you did before the trauma. But in some cases, the stress response system stays activated, and we don't fully understand why this happens in some individuals and not others, but we do understand that there is a correlation with allostatic load, which again includes things like prior injuries, inflammation, and exposure to adverse events in childhood. So those with childhood trauma are more likely to have an increased allostatic load throughout life, and be more susceptible to developing PTSD following trauma in adulthood. And I have friends who have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they never had it explained to them. So, their physician or clinical psychologist said, you have PTSD and here are your options for treatment, but they never really understood it. So for those of you who really don't understand it, I'll break it down to you in this simplest form. Ultimately, we have to have the post-traumatic stress symptoms that I'll mention here in just a second that last longer than 30 days following an experience of trauma. So a person has to experience trauma, and then 30 days afterwards, they still have to be experiencing these symptoms. And they have to have all of them. So symptoms of avoidance, meaning you're changing your behavior to avoid a specific area where you think you might be triggered and have an increased stress response to something, or maybe have a panic attack or anxiety attack, for example. You also have to have symptoms of intrusion, which means something like flashbacks or even nightmares about the trauma, or it could be unrelated to the trauma even. There has to be symptoms of hyperarousal as well, which some of you may refer to as hypervigilance and enhanced startle responses. And there also has to be changes in mood or cognition. So this could be depression, anxiety, it could be brain fog and memory issues even. So those all have to be present for a person to have clinically diagnosable PTSD. And many people, you may have heard of people dropping the D, so they don't like to include disorder in post-traumatic stress. I want to make sure that everybody understands the difference, that post-traumatic stress is normal. The disorder and why it's got a bad rap is that the disorder has been, I think people who use the term or who have been diagnosed with PTSD, the disorder starts to become self-referential, meaning that people think about themselves as being disordered, and that is absolutely not the case. The disorder part talks about the stress response system and only that. So it is basically a stress response system that stays highly activated, which isn't the ideal, and that's what's disordered. The person is not disordered, and I really want people to know that. But I do understand that it has a bad connotation, and that's why people drop the D. So for those of you who have heard that, that is why people are trying to change the stigmatization, and I think that that's a good thing, because as long as things are stigmatized, it keeps people in the dark, and we don't have the conversations we need to have. I think other people have brought up terms like PTG, or post-traumatic growth, and that's a really beautiful term that people use to refer to the growth and transformation that they may experience following trauma. And it has a really good positive connotation for people, showing that they overcame something significant and grew from it. There's also PTSI, or post-traumatic stress injury. So again, the people who prefer not to use the term disorder might interchange the D with an I, saying that really what PTSD is an injury to the nervous system or the psyche. And I really want to, people sometimes throw the term around very casually, and I want to make sure everybody understands that PTSD is no joke. It is extremely debilitating for anyone experiencing it, and true peace, rest, and relaxation can be elusive for people. There is a great deal of symptom overlap, as you can see from this image, with TBI and PTSD, and I have heard of and know of people who have been misdiagnosed, including within the special operations community, as having PTSD, when in reality they had lingering symptoms from traumatic brain injury and the chronic stress of their profession. So it's important to know, if you can think back and you can say for yourself, I haven't experienced trauma in a way that, I loved what I did, and I wasn't traumatized by it, and I didn't have anything that made me really fearful in the long term for my life. But you have sustained traumatic brain injury, it may be possible that you have chronic symptoms of TBI and that you don't have PTSD. But it is important to know what it is, in case any of you listening are wondering whether you might have a stress response system that kind of has its foot stuck on the gas pedal. And then pivoting just a little bit, still talking about trauma. Moral injury. This is a term I was actually really surprised. I did a poll to find out how many of my friends in the veteran community and first responder community had heard of this term before. And less than half of the individuals I polled had heard of moral injury. And I'm going to read this, so my apologies for just reading what's here, but I want to make sure that we do cover and understand and are on the same page about what it is. But in traumatic or unusually stressful circumstances, people may perpetrate, which means to act, so an act of commission. They may fail to prevent, which is called an act of omission, or they may witness events that contradict deeply held moral beliefs or expectations, which can include betrayal from leadership, from others in positions of power, or even their peers. This is what occurs when a person has the lasting effects from this traumatic or stressful circumstance that leads to emotional, psychological, behavioral, social, and spiritual functioning. The difference here is that this is not a disorder of the stress response system, and it is not a diagnosis or disorder. So you will not find this in the DSM-5, and no one will necessarily diagnose someone with this. But it's important to know what it is because it has lasting effects on people who experience it. And those lingering symptoms are very intense and overpowering. And I've worked with people who have been dealing with moral injury, and there are very, very heavy feelings around it, including guilt and shame, which is sort of a generalization of the guilt to the self. And instead of saying I did something bad, people start to say that I personally am bad because of what I did. Disgust and anger can also occur and be very common. An inability to self-forgive and subsequently engaging in self-sabotaging behaviors is extremely common. People start to feel like they don't deserve to live, that they don't deserve to have healthy relationships or to succeed in life, and that can be very debilitating. And the crux of it is that there are often very spiritual and existential crises that people can experience, and that can be very challenging. And in the individuals that I've worked with who have experienced moral injury, it seems that the way through it for them involved helping them get to a place of forgiveness for themselves or for the other people involved. And almost like with post-traumatic growth, they had to use the experience as a way to transform themselves into the kind of person that they really wanted to be. And I truly believe that there can be a silver lining in any experience like this if we choose to work hard at assigning meaning to it. Okay, so we've talked about a lot here, and we're going to now discuss what is the cumulative effect of all of this. And again, not every individual experiences all of what we're talking about. There could be little, aspects of each thing, or maybe just a couple of things that we've discussed that a person deals with. But again, the backdrop of all of this is allostatic load, or the accumulative effect of stress and injuries and exposures. So I think you're starting to see how intertwined and synergistic all of this is and how complex it is. This is what veterans commonly face. And again, please remember that these are common symptoms, but not every veteran will experience any or even all of these symptoms. There are some service members who retire to go on and have very few service-related issues, and maybe that's not super common, but please don't, for those of you who are non-veterans, please don't look at this and use it as a filter for how you see every veteran that you meet. And if you are a veteran, please remember that you don't have to go looking for something to be wrong. You might actually be okay. And I have a friend who says it's okay to be okay. So if you're feeling good, you might really be good. And I think that's awesome. But for those of you who aren't and who are dealing with lingering symptoms, these are really important to know. Gastrointestinal dysfunction can be due to inflammation. It could be due to inflammation from traumatic brain injury that becomes systemic inflammation. We didn't really talk a lot about gut health and the gut microbiome. That is a whole other topic that is relevant and really important. We just don't have time to cover it, but that can be something that exists due to traumatic brain injury. But it can also come from antibiotic use or oral medications, which can often happen in the military. And consuming poor quality food and beverages that irritate the GI lining can also happen after any kind of infection or inflammation from other exposures. Respiratory illness and respiratory dysfunction is, I think, pretty straightforward when we talk about airborne hazards, burn pits, and toxins. The immune dysfunction can be unmitigated inflammation. It could be related to autoimmune diseases and cancers. And endocrine dysfunction is, I mentioned this a couple of times, can be due to TBI, can be due to chronic stress or allostatic load. And this is really, really important, and I want everyone to hear this. Alcohol is a sledgehammer to your neuroendocrine dysfunction. And I know nobody wants to hear that, especially this time of year when everybody's, gathering with friends and family and probably having a few drinks. But for those of you who are inhabiting a body that is injured or trying to overcome or repair from something, alcohol is the last thing that you need. And I'm not, there's no judgment here at all. I just want you to be informed about it. It's, there's very little benefit for people who are in a state of needing repair. So just keep that in mind, please. Memory, concentration, and cognitive impairments are pretty obvious when we talk about traumatic brain injury, but anything that affects sleep, so chronic stress and PTSD, all of those things can affect sleep and then impact your cognitive abilities. Chronic pain and musculoskeletal problems are very common. I don't think I have to explain that one. Anyone who served in the military seems like they, come out with joints that are a few decades older than they actually are, just given all of the things that they have to do, and just, even carrying a heavy rucksack in and of itself can certainly compress low back discs and cause some pain. But also anyone who has a traumatic brain injury or PT or post-traumatic stress disorder typically will experience increased pain severity. So that's something to keep in mind. Headaches, vestibular and vision impairments, very common with TBI. Hypervigilance, stress reactivity, I mentioned that with TBI and PTSD. Anger is a very common thing following traumatic brain injury, and there may be a number of reasons why, including potentially impulse control for some individuals who have certain areas of the brain affected, but that is very common. Worry, rumination, and anxiety are also super common, as are sleep disturbances. I mean, if you have anything that affects endocrine function that is impaired in some way, you could suffer from sleep issues, but also traumatic brain injury, any kind of pain, headaches, hypervigilance, substance use, alcohol, all of these things can impact sleep to a great degree. Following TBI, a lot of times men and women will experience some kind of sleep apnea. So it could be obstructive sleep apnea, but there are folks who actually have what's called central sleep apnea, where there is no obstruction to their airway, but their brain literally stops sending the signal to breathe. And it's only when they have carbon dioxide buildup that they actually kind of startle awake a little bit and start breathing again. And then we have substance abuse, which is also very common in these populations. But I want to pause here for a second and just mention that I hope people have compassion around this, because for those who use drugs and alcohol, when you're looking at this list of symptoms and you're looking at what people are experiencing and how uncomfortable it must be in that physical body and in that whatever mental state this person is in, using drugs and alcohol to escape that is understandable. It's kind of like, in my mind, I think about it, it's like, well, no wonder if we don't have any other tools for managing these really difficult and very complicated situations, we're gonna want to escape it. We are not gonna want to sit there and feel the heaviness and the intensity of all of what we're feeling. So of course, we're going to turn to some sort of substance to pull us out of that and to try to help us not feel the pain and the weight of what we're feeling, of this grief and just discomfort in our own body and the loss that people often experience. So please have compassion for yourself if you're dealing with substance abuse, or for others in your life who may be dealing with substance abuse. People turn to substances when they're carrying a tremendous amount of pain. And again, please just have some compassion there and have a discussion around it. And again, the only way through some of that for people is to ask for help. And we'll talk about that in just a second in a little bit more detail. With sexual health and intimacy, that is often related to endocrine dysfunction, and low testosterone for men is very common in these communities. That can also lead to depression. It's very common. It can lead to brain fog, memory issues, sleep issues, all of that. And then marital, family, and community dysfunction. Again, if a person is doing their best to survive and they are spending every ounce of energy they have just to hold themselves together, they're not going to have the best capacity to relate to and hold space and connect with those in their lives. And that could be their spouse or their children, brothers and sisters. It could be their friends. And again, you know, sometimes people come across as being selfish when they're in this place of survival. But again, if we can all understand this a bit better and give each other some grace around it and maybe help each other through it, I think that you know, that would be a great benefit. But it is very common. Divorce rates are very high in the military and veteran populations. And then transition from military to civilian life. Donnie and Matt both can speak to this in a great degree, because with professional athletes, I mean, this is something that, you know, I think Donnie has done such an incredible job with the transition program that he's created for NFL players and special operations service members, because this is no joke. This is a huge part of what affects people, and it is not discussed enough, and it's not given enough weight. You know, when somebody spends so much time in the military or on a professional sports team, they have so many things that are a part of that they no longer have afterwards. So in this transition time, you know, a lot of times these athletes and folks in the military can feel like they've lost their identity, especially those in special operations and at the professional athlete level. You know, you're at a very elite level and you're surrounded by elite individuals doing incredible things. So life outside of the military, it can be very mundane. It can feel very boring. Additionally, whether you're special operations or not, I mean, you transition out of the military, you can feel like you've lost your community or tribe. You can feel like you've lost a sense of purpose, sense of meaning. You've certainly lost structure. You have lost playing an important role in something bigger, and you've lost this sense of an earned success and contributing to something bigger than yourself. And all of these things, again, are sort of automatic in a military career on a professional sports team. They were given to you, and as you know, a retired service member or athlete, you know, you may be hard pressed to find that in the kind of conventional civilian world. And I encourage people to try to create that as best they can and connect with people. And, you know, if you can't find it, can you build it? And it's really critical for people, because that really can affect folks in a tremendous way. And I just want to pause again and say something about this transition, that, you know, for those of you who feel like that was your identity and you were part of something elite or part of something bigger and you no longer have that, I want to make sure that you're aware that what made you successful in those roles is inherently part of who you are. So even though you may not be doing that role anymore, what made you successful and able to accomplish so much is still there with you, and it will make you successful in anything that you choose to do next. So that can be applied to any future endeavor, and it's really important that you remember that that can't be taken away from you. Finally, moving on to the last couple of ones, there's existential issues in these communities of, you know, mindset that discounts the future. When you're in life and death scenarios, often you don't think about, you know, what is life going to be like in 5 years or 10 years. There's also a fear of developing these invisible wounds. You guys have probably heard the term CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is very widely known now in the NFL community and even in the military communities. It's starting to be talked about more and more, and there is a fear around that. And there's also a fear around this other term for blast trauma, which is IAS. It's sort of the equivalent of CTE, but there are things that we can do to help ourselves and to heal the brain. And I will get to the good stuff soon, I promise. Again, depression is very common. And I just want to say a couple of things about suicide. Suicide rates are higher in these communities, and TBI and PTSD are both lead to an increased risk for suicidal ideation. And I want everybody to take a look at this list, and it's easy to understand why somebody might lose hope when you look at this list of symptoms. And even if you're only experiencing a few of these, if you think this is your new normal and nothing can be done to change this, and you don't have hope, of course you're going to be suffering, you know, a great deal. And you're going to be suffering a great deal, and it's going to be something that is really scary for people. And that loss of hope, I think, is what contributes a lot to individuals who choose to end their lives. You know, and you are dealing with this massive amount of pain, and you know, a problem that seems so complex and overwhelming that you just don't know what to do with it, and you don't want to burden your loved ones with that. It's a very scary place to be, and I want people to come away with this knowing that there is hope. And for those of you who are contemplating suicide, or for those of you who are worried about your loved ones who may be contemplating suicide, please, please, please talk about it. You will not make somebody suicidal by having a conversation about suicide. It's actually quite the opposite. So even if you're unsure of how to have the conversation, name it. Say, you know, I don't feel like I have the skills to talk about this, but I love you and I'm concerned about you. And I really want to know, you know, how you're doing, and if you are having suicidal thoughts, and have you come up with a plan, and can we talk about that? And you know, there are resources out there that are really helpful for folks in this space. So again, please just shed light on this. We can't keep suffering in silence. We need to destigmatize and shed light on this and connect with each other over it. So finally, the last little bit of time that we have, there's some good news, and there's a lot that we can do to heal. I would love to have tons more time to talk about all of this, because I know that's what a lot of people are here for. So if anybody, you know, is really interested in finding out more, please reach out to me or Tiffany or Matt or Donnie, because there's a lot that we can share with you resource-wise and information-wise, again, to emphasize that there is hope. There are tools that we can use to heal. And again, because I don't have a ton of time to get into the details of all of these, I'll just say that there are some PTSD specific tools. Stellate ganglion block has been very effective for some individuals dealing with PTSD symptoms, but also it can be very effective for chronic pain. And EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, is a type of therapy that can be really effective for addressing post-traumatic stress disorder and helping people move through it. But it also is really effective for depression, chronic pain, and addictions, and other traumatic experiences. The VA has, you know, traditional psychotherapy and medications, and I know a lot of people are very anti that. I would just say that it has helped some people, and I do know people who are on medication. So that is something that I would, you know, I don't want to stigmatize that for anybody who's suffering and found help through traditional medications. It does help some people. Finally, we have some brain injury specific tools. Again, I'm not going to talk about all of these. There's a list here. None of these are FDA approved therapies. A lot of this comes from anecdotal evidence that where people have tried different things and said, this is what has healed my brain, this is what has saved me. So again, you know, we have to use ourselves as guinea pigs, unfortunately, and a lot of times we've got to use things in combination. There is no silver bullet in this work. We've got to often take an approach that involves a number of different therapeutics. We also, the goal of brain injury recovery is promoting an anti-inflammatory and reparative state. So again, anything that we can do to control inflammation, to calm our nervous system, and to mitigate further stressors that add to allostatic load that keep us in that sort of preventing healing and keeping us primed for exaggerated responses following other types of injuries. Again, apologize for running through all of this a little bit quickly. We only have a couple minutes here. Low-hanging fruit, this is stuff that everybody should be doing on a regular basis, not just when we're injured. These are the things that kind of increase your bank account for, I guess, dealing with allostatic load. So these are the things that help us build resilience and keep our tank a little bit fuller so we're not running on empty all the time. So movement, sleep, spending time outside and in nature, eating clean. Really, truly, one of the biggest things is spending time with loved ones and people who you have a good, close relationship with, and sharing stories. Not everybody, you know, deserves to hear your story maybe, but share the things that are important to you with somebody who really understands and can connect with you on that. That storytelling, I think, is often overlooked as an important thing that keeps us connected and well, but it is really important. There are other things like breath work and down regulating activities, journaling, recognizing when you're overloaded before you burn out is critical. And then other things like body work and therapy and functional medicine are awesome, but they can be cost prohibitive for some folks. But if you can afford them and have access to them, they're critical. And functional medicine providers, this icon in the top right, if you can work with somebody who's been certified through the Institute for Functional Medicine or another certifying body, somebody who really understands the complexities of hormones and doesn't just measure testosterone and put you on testosterone replacement, but really looks upstream to see where the problem might be. Is it in the brain or elsewhere? That's the kind of person that you want to work with. It's critical to remember that mental health and physical health are tightly intertwined. If you improve one, you're going to improve the other. But if you ignore one, you're only going to be able to improve the other so much. Finally, some things to consider for veterans out there: you have to be your own health advocate. We oftentimes, the veteran community will be seen by healthcare providers, and they'll say, well, you're young and otherwise healthy, you can't possibly have any of these things. Please, 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 if you're feeling off or something isn't right, find new providers who will listen to you and believe you. You have to fight for yourself because things can be overlooked sometimes. And the healthcare community doesn't always understand these complex issues. Don't take on too many things at once to overwhelm yourself and fail, set yourself up for failure. You want to just pick a couple of positive changes and do them with success, and then add over time. Say no more, say no more frequently, I guess is the best way to say that. And don't take on too much that's going to add to your allostatic load. This next one's critical. There is no silver bullet. Unfortunately, I wish I had better news, but this work is really hard and it takes time. But I promise you, if you put these things into practice, it will move the needle over time in a very sustainable way. Finally, compartmentalization is something that can be an obstacle to healing and connecting with others, and it does serve a purpose, but that's a pattern that a lot of people have to break out of. And again, please ask for help if you need it. Vulnerability isn't easy, but we weren't meant to do this work alone. And I'll leave you with this quote: ground on which we can only be saved from destruction by fighting without delay is desperate ground. On desperate ground, fight. If you fight with all your might, there is a chance of life, whereas death is certain if you cling to your corner. And if anybody needs to reach me, please send me an email at kate@thisisthewayback.com. And with that, we can jump into the Q&A with Donnie and Matt with the time that we have left.
Awesome. Dr. Pate, that was an amazing presentation and so informative. And I know we're kind of behind on time here, but I wanted her to get through that because I think there's so many wonderful resources that she offers and can explain. But I will say we'll stay here as long as we can past the time. So we'll kind of go into the Q&A right now and do that. If you have any questions, you're welcome to drop them in the chat. We're also going to go over some of when you registered, we asked you some questions. So we'll dive into that wasn't covered as well. And then just a reminder, we will have another webinar with Dr. Pate in February. So what we don't cover and some other topics, we'll go into that too. So, and this is being recorded and we will make it into YouTube to share with everybody that registered. And then you can share that with everybody else. So let's just dive into the Q&A. And Donnie, just talk a little bit about the NFL and the Veteran TBI retreat that you were talking about earlier. Can you give us some more information?
Yeah, for the last 9 years, I've been working with the NFL with our transition program. It's called NFL Legends Community, and we also have the Trust. And started back in 2013, and this is something that that we never had before. As you know, no one ever talked about it. I think as we continue to go on, I think it's important that we came together and figure out some of the things that we need post-career to transition back into the real world. And I'll tell you, it's been wonderful. It's been a lot of growth, a lot of understanding, and then we expanded that into our military. Actually, I have a good friend, Alex Buggy, who's a Navy SEAL, who said we don't have anything like this in our military. So we decided to put together with the tools that I've learned from the NFL with our transition program and applying it to our special operations. And truly, it's so similar. I mean, as you know, there's so many similarities between the two. Obviously, a little bit different in terms of life and death, but just transitioning back to something that you truly love, it's just been amazing. We call it the Stronghold. We do it in Utah. And it's just been fantastic. Having talked to Kate out there, and also it's just been really wonderful. So we'll continue to expand that and bring more of that group together where we can sit and discuss and to help each other out.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's interesting to hear the parallels. I think we all go through transitions in different ways, but to hear the parallels that are there for NFL players and for our veterans, especially when it relates to TBI, and hearing what Dr. Pate was saying is, something that I don't always think about and I had not really related to. So very interesting and great work that you're doing, Donnie, for our veterans as well. So thank you. Matt, do you want to share a little bit about your experiences with TBI and resources that you have used in the past?
Yeah, for sure. And I do want to comment on what Donnie just said too. I think that the link that Donnie you're showing between NFL players and military folks shows that it's a truly human issue, right? I think too often as veterans, we get stuck in this broken veteran mindset where, oh, the stuff that happened to me, I can't fix it. I can't get out of it. But I think there's so many ways that humans can come to the same point of traumatic brain injury or CTE or post-traumatic stress, all the stuff that Doc just talked about. And to know that it can happen to superheroes on the gridiron that you watch on TV, right? But there is actually a path forward, I think is really powerful. One of the comments that I'll address, somebody said, they'd like to hear a success story. And so that's where I'll jump in. I think I am an emerging success story. So I transitioned out of the service, and I've been with Amazon now for almost 3 years. It's almost my 3-year anniversary. And the first 2.5 years of that were pretty rough for me. High anxiety, hypervigilance, depression, and I'll be real vulnerable here, but I was even admitted to the hospital about 7 months ago. My doctors thought I was having heart attacks. Turns out they were panic attacks, which was very confusing for me to deal with, because how did I go from being able to be overseas and live as ops and stuff and be fine to now driving to the supermarket was wrecking me. And, I had a steady state of anxiety that if I didn't feel anxious, felt weird enough that I tried to fill in stress to get back to that. And the reason I'm an emerging success story is really because of Doc Pate and her approach. And I hope that in these follow-on sessions that we can get into, to more of here's what works. But if I could summarize it real quickly, it would be that I tried meditation and I tried talk therapy and all this stuff. And I always felt like I was pushing a rock uphill to try to get to where I wanted to go. Doc Pate's method, really, by focusing on the physiological, improving your gut health so that your inflammation in your brain goes down. And I've been diagnosed with traumatic brain injury and PTSD. But that inflammation from that traumatic brain injury, getting that inflammation under control, seeking out quiet time to where I could down-regulate my brain and let my brain spool down, which felt weird for me because I wanted to fill it in. I was anxious, so I wanted to run away from that quiet noise. But she has guided me, and many others, through the retreat with Donnie, she's guided others as well to that same path that you can do actionable things each day, and it removes that rock. That's how I feel, is that rock has been removed. Now I can start to deal with moral injury. Now I can start to deal with those things that I haven't quite sorted out yet, because the physiological things, the hormonal things that were blocking me, I realized they're normal because they were explained to me just how she just explained to everybody, and that it's just going on in your system. And the more that you can take action, then the more you can start to deal with that stuff.
Yeah, and I thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing your story. I think just that alone is something for people to recognize that, everybody is struggling with different things, and you can be in any job level, any kind of, where you are in your life, you can have those issues. And I think it's important for others to hear how people are kind of pulling themselves out of that. It's not a quick process. It takes time and takes a lot of different resources to bring us to that. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go to some of the questions from when you registered for the event. And Dr. Pate, I think this one's kind of directed at you a little bit. And it's like, how do you advise us to support other veterans when they transition, when mental health is not often as easy as a topic to discuss with them? And what's your advice on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the thing that I've found to be the most useful, especially when we're talking like veteran to veteran, it is that um, that shared connection and vulnerability. And so maybe you're addressing, you see a friend or a former teammate or something like that who's struggling. They're not often going to be the first to share. When people are struggling, they don't really want to open up. They want to know that this person is a safe person to discuss things with. So if you are in a space where you can share your own struggles, whether you're currently in it or you made your way through it, regardless, if you can open up and be the first to share and say, here's what I dealt with, or here's what I'm dealing with, now all of a sudden that person feels like, oh, I'm not going to be judged. I'm not going to be shamed. This is something that this person's dealing with, but also there's no judgment there. Then they may open up and start to share more, and you might be able to find that common thread. But vulnerability is the key to that, and it's really hard. I mean, it's probably the hardest thing we can all do, and there is no guarantee how the other person will respond. But in that kind of a setting, that sort of is the first step, I think, to making it okay for the other person to open up.
Yeah, I think it's like, it's so hard. It's so hard to know what the best way to communicate when it's such a hard topic to talk about anyways. I mean, it has always been, and it always, we're starting to talk about it more in our general communities a lot more. You see a lot more celebrities and other athletes talking about their mental health struggles, which has made it a little bit easier for us to really start looking at ways to get help. And hopefully a webinar like this will maybe bring some resources to people that maybe didn't know they existed, or other ways of thinking of things, but also to let them know they're not alone. I think that's the biggest thing to remember. You're not alone in this, and that there's multiple resources available for you. And one that I kind of want to highlight, and I know Dr. Pate had it on one of her slides, but there is the National Crisis Line, and they just released a new three-digit number and text that you can reach them at, which is 988. And if you're a veteran, you can call 988 and press 1 anytime. And that's for you and your family members to use. So know that that resource is available to you. And I know we've gone over time a little bit, and you're welcome to stay. And if you have any additional questions, you can surely ask them. We'll stay on for a few more minutes. And like I said, I'll have this recording and make sure we send it out to everybody that's registered so that you'll have it. But if you need to go, we wish you best holiday season. I know this can be a super stressful time for everybody, but like I said, just remember that you're not alone and there's multiple resources out there for you. Dr. Pate or Donnie, do you guys have anything else that you would like to say?
Well, I'll just expand on what you're just talking about. I mean, you talk about the vulnerability, right? And it's setting the right time to talk about mental, health. I mean, it's not always the right time, of course. And it was difficult for us, as veterans and former NFL players. I mean, we've been conditioned our whole entire life to be tough, never show any signs of vulnerability at all, right? I mean, are you hurt? No, I'm not hurt. Keep going. You want to be with the team. You want to be part of something bigger than yourself. You never want to let your teammates down. And showing that chink in the armor is not really popular, right? It doesn't matter if you've been out for a little bit. When you run into some of your friends, it's like, hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm doing great. I'm doing great. I'm good. You know what I mean? Because it's not the right time, and we always trying to put this armor out there. But the reality is that we're all humans, right? We're all humans, and we all go through different things. That's why I just think that the connection with veterans and NFL players is so strong, because our whole entire life, since 7 years old, I mean, I've been playing football, and to be tough, to have all this, and then all of a sudden it's over, and I'm still young enough, and trying to grab all the excitement and being the top of my game, and then trying to transition to out of it and trying to understand all the different physiology changes that I'm having in myself, mentally and physically, and how to deal with that. And unfortunately, we feel like we're dealing with it by ourselves and no one else is understanding what's going on. And the reality is, when we do have that time to talk about it, we realize that, you know what, you're not the only one. And it's somewhat comforting to know that, okay, I'm not, going crazy out of my head. And then you start to understand, what's going on, and you start to understand and have the knowledge to start helping yourself. So.
Yeah, and I love that, and thank you for sharing that, because it's very true. People coming from these communities are definitely conditioned to be stoic and tough, and keep it all inside and go it alone, right? Shoulder it alone, and it is really challenging. And I want to share that you don't have to be skillful at this stuff. Most of us are not. We were never taught how to talk about mental health or how we're doing, and so you're going to fumble through it. And you can even just name that and just say, I don't even know how to talk about this, but here's what's going on. And I'm not even sure I know how I feel because I haven't been in touch with my emotions forever. And, like it's okay to not be good at this stuff, but just opening the door to conversation is the key. And we can all fumble through it together and find some people and some resources that can kind of help guide us.
Yeah, but definitely like learning and having the tips and understanding and having the knowledge is so important, because as I get to learn, some of the knowledge that you put forth today, it helps me, and then I can help my brothers, and we can all help each other. I mean, that's what it's about. I mean, we're all, the top of what we've done, and we can still be that as we continue to transition to civilian life.
And I think that's what's important, is knowing that there is a path and that you're not actually broken. I got to had the honor of meeting a quadruple amputee named Travis Mills about a month ago. And I can't even imagine, what a recalibration of your life that is, to literally lose all 4 limbs. And he's got this amazing attitude. And I said to him, like, thank you for, your service and sacrifice. And he goes, hey, I'm not broken. I'm recalibrated. I had to change my day because of what happened to me. Now it takes me longer to get ready in the morning, and that's it. But then I've figured out how to progress and go forward. And that has been so powerful, his example to me, because I think even in mental health, it's the same, right? You can look at it as a broken, or you can know that, hey, there's some recalibration you're gonna have to do. Your day's gonna be maybe a little different. There's some, I never drank kombucha before, but now Doug has me drinking kombucha for gut health. Never thought that would happen. Donnie does it too. And that's a little bit of a joke, but I'm saying, like, there's changes that you can make that actually will let your life continue to progress forward. There is hope.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think one of my hardest transition is to remember that I'm not going to be the person I was before. And it's okay to not be that person, because I think a lot of my struggles dealt with the wheel of like, well, I don't feel like I did before. Why don't I feel that way? I feel bad that I feel that way. I feel guilty that I feel that way. And I'm stuck in this wheel. And then, realizing, wait, I don't think I'll ever feel that way. And I have to get used to this new norm. And I know that's not probably the best way to say it, but it really, I had to let go of that person and grieve that person that I was, and learn how to deal with who I am now, right? And that for me was thinking of ways to deal with the issues that I'm having, right? Setting up different things to cope with it, to deal with it in that way, and then transitioning to, okay, I'm okay. I'm different, but I'm still okay with who I am right now, right? I think that's too is one of the things that we don't talk about things, and so we don't realize that other people are struggling and transitioning the same way. And that's why I think having people like you guys on and talking about experiences is so important for others to see as well.
Well, that's where the growth happens, is when you recognize what you did in the past and where you are going forward. I mean, once you recognize, like, I did that, now it's time to move forward, that's when you're going to start growing. But the problem for so many of us, I mean, I want to continue to do what I've been doing my whole entire life, you know what I mean? And I can't find that high. And I know that was a time in my life. And once I realized, like, that was a past and now I need to move forward, that's when I started to grow as a person. I'm telling you, open up my world. But, I was holding on still. I mean, as I, finished, I was still doing everything like I was still playing. And my wife called me out. She's like, why are you lifting so much weights anymore? I'm like, this is what I do, And then internally, I was a little vulnerable because I didn't know, like, okay, then what else do I do? Right. And once I was able to, like, understand that and to be aware of it, to say, okay, as much as this is going to hurt me, to just let this go, what I've achieved in my life and who I am, would identify myself, my purpose and everything, to go off to the uncharted territories where I feel vulnerable. I mean, that's when you start to grow. And just like when you're a rookie, as I say, trying to become a starter and all the work that you put in, you have to take that same mentality that you did as a rookie in order to get a starting job into the next chapter of your life. And that's where you're going to start growing. So.
Yeah, I agree for sure. Well, I think we'll go ahead and stop there for now. And like I said, we're going to have another great webinar with Dr. Pate in February and fully bring Donnie back on as well and Matt. So look forward to that and look for information in the new year, and we'll send out more information about that. But thank you for joining us today. Like I said, I know it's the holiday season. Take care of yourself, check on your loved ones, check on people around you. This time of year can be hard and stressful all in itself, not to mention all the things that have gone on in the last couple of years. So please look out for others as well. But thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.